Hello, everyone, and welcome to the St. Louis Art Museum's Art Speaks program. My name is Jessica Kennedy, and I'm the educator for adult learning at the museum. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located on your screen. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program, and we will choose a few to answer at the end. Also, there is live auto transcription available for this program. Please click the CC icon to activate or deactivate the subtitles. For today's talk, Art Speaks, Joan Miró and Surrealism, we are joined by Simon Kelly, curator and head of the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art here at the museum. Thanks so much for being here today, Simon.
Thanks, Jessica. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming today. So I'm very pleased to be speaking about this topic, Joan Miró and Surrealism. This talk is in connection with a special installation that we have at the moment at the museum. Joan Miró in the Nancy and Kenneth Kranzberg Gallery, 211. And this installation celebrates the recent promised gift of two Miró paintings, a promised gift from Emily Pulitzer. These are wonderful paintings. They make a big impact to our collection, and we wanted to put together an installation which really contextualized these two works with the prints, the drawings, and the one other Miró painting that we already have in the collection. So I hope that if you have a chance, you'll come along to see the installation. You can see the dates at the bottom of the screen. So what I'm going to do today is really just give some broader context to these two works. You know, as I said, they're important paintings by Miró. The 48 is from 1927, which is really, I think, the period of Miro's career when he's producing his most radical paintings. And then the painting 1953 on the left here in this installation shot is a large painting. You know, it's 8 feet high, and it's really the kind of canonical Miró language of pictographic signs and symbols for which the artist is best known. And I wanted to show this just to recognize Joseph Pulitzer Jr. and Emily Rauh Pulitzer, because this is such an important promised gift for the museum. And really just to recognize, you know, their long-standing interest in the work of Miró. That's actually recognized if you look at the collection catalog. The painting 1953 work is on the cover of volume 3. So Miró was born in 1893. He was born in Barcelona, and he spent his early years in Spain. He didn't go to Paris until 1920. This is an early self-portrait that he painted when he was still in Barcelona. When he's looking towards, I think, Cubism in particular, you can see in terms of the kind of faceting of form. And this one has an interesting provenance because he gave this painting to Pablo Picasso, so it's in the Musée Picasso in Paris. Actually, before I go on, I did want to give a shout out also to Abby Yoder, who's my research assistant and has been really helpful in putting this PowerPoint together. So thanks, Abby. I think space, kind of geography, is important for Miro's career. As I said, he was born in Barcelona. His family bought a farm at a place called Montroig, just outside of Tarragona. As we'll see, that will become an important motif for Miró. And he lived the last decades of his life in Palma on Mallorca. So there's what's often called the Miro Triangle, between Barcelona and Montroig and Palma. Those areas are really important to his career. And his Catalan identity is also really important. He comes back to that again and again in his career. The importance of Catalonia, this area, this region of northeastern Spain, which still has a very strong sense of identity. So that's an important theme within his career. And then, thinking about that sort of dialogue between Paris and Spain, Catalonia is also kind of central axis, if you like, within Miro's career. So just to sort of run relatively quickly through his early work, the Kemper actually, has a really nice selection of Miro's paintings. I have 3 paintings. This is an early work where he's looking at obviously at Fauvism. You can see the face with the greens and the mauves and the yellows, and then the painting on the right is has some of that depth of Fauvism, but you can also see the kind of cubist faceting of form that we saw in the self-portrait. And then that kind of leads into the painting that we already have in the museum, which is a strange painting, I think. It's an important painting. It's large scale, and it's this early standing nude, where again you see that sort of fusion of cubism and Fauvism. I think the background to me is really interesting. That the flowers and the birds that you can see in this kind of hanging wall hanging or tapestry. These kind of look forward to the later language that you'll see in Miro's more mature work. And then 1920 he comes to Paris, but he's still thinking about Spain, and he's kind of during that decade of the 20s, he's going back and forth between Paris and Montrouge in particular, Barcelona. This painting is a well-known work. It belonged to Ernest Hemingway. It's called The Farm, and it's a memory of his farm, which his family bought around 1910. And it's in his kind of more hyper-realistic style from the early 1920s. You can see the various details. This farm was actually not as ramshackle as that. He's kind of accentuated that aspect. The tree, the eucalyptus tree in the center is obviously a kind of focus. I like the kind of symmetry of the way he represents the leaves, and then there's various details. This is a very arid landscape. The sky is just so blue. Blue is a color that Miro returns to again and again. He said in one letter that when he was at Montrouge, he wanted to lick the sky. It has a very kind of visceral relationship with the landscape. So you can see here the water. Water is obviously such an important aspect of farm life. You can see the system, but also the well further back, and then the various details. The cute little rabbits, the rooster, the goat here. The newspaper is kind of interesting because it's kind of cut, but it's references L'Intransigeant, which was actually a radical newspaper in Paris. So there's a kind of shout out to his Paris associations here. The moon, I mean, it kind of looks like the moon, although it's ostensibly a sunny scene. It kind of looks forward to his later, focus on that motif. Nature, the land, although, Miro never thought of himself as an abstract painter. He denied that very strongly. So even though other people saw his works as abstract, he always saw his paintings as grounded in nature. And as I said, Hemingway bought this painting. I was actually in Key West about 18 months ago, and they have a sort of little narrative there which speaks to the time that the painting was at Hemingway's house in Key West. But Hemingway and Miro were friends in the 1920s, and they actually, interestingly, they were sparring partners. Miro boxed, as did Hemingway, but Hemingway was about twice the size of Miro. So Miro talked in one of his interviews that he came up to, I think he said he came up to Miro's waist, but apparently he still was an excellent sparring partner. this is a painting from a little bit later, which speaks to Miro's ongoing fascination with Catalan culture and traditions. The Baratina, which is the red cap at the top, is kind of became a symbol of Catalan identity and the sort of Catalan yearning for independence, and it appears again and again in a lot of Miro's imagery. And then you can see the sort of abstracting of the eyes and the beard form in the rest of the painting. And then this is a really important work from around from 1925. You can see he's sort of at this point, he's moving away from that hyperreal language that he was using in the early 20s and really developing the language of what he called signs. So you can see here the red balloon on the right, probably the kite at the top left, this kind of figure at the bottom left with a white head, the kind of spidery form at the bottom left also. Spiders often appear in his work of the 20s. I've always been struck by the drip painting effect that Miro is using here, which really kind of looks forward to abstract expressionism in many ways, and a lot of the abstract expressionists were interested in Miro's painting techniques. So there's a kind of interesting mixture here of spontaneity. Miro was interested in the surrealist idea of automatism, of automatic painting, and sort of releasing or sort of not giving any place to rationality within his mark making. At the same time, we know from research that has been done around Miro's work at this time. Anne Umland has done greater work around this. There was a recent show at MoMA around this painting. We know that the Miro was producing preparatory drawings for a number of these works, which kind of complicate the idea of his spontaneity in works like Birth of the World. And this is a moment in the mid-20s when Miro is integrating with a lot of surrealist poets and writers, and that aspect, the interest in language, really impacts his work. These paintings are often called poésie, poetry paintings. So he's integrating text alongside imagery. So the bottom right, Ceci et la couleur de mes rêves, this is the color of my dreams. The calligraphy is actually really beautiful here. The photo is apparently based on a sign that he saw. Blue, the color of his dreams, I mentioned, is a color that reappears again and again as an important color within his kind of personal universe. So yeah, he's mixing with poets, people like Artaud, Apollinaire, Michel Léris, who is a writer, ethnographer, poet, he talked about as being his closest friend at this point. But he's never, it's interesting, he shows in certain surrealist shows. He showed in this exhibition at top left of surrealist painting, really important early surrealist exhibition at the Galerie Pierre, where he also had individual shows. He had some association with the Galerie Surrealist at the bottom right. That was an interesting space in itself, where Oceanic and African and Native American works were shown alongside the surrealist paintings. But I think it's important to realize that, Miro himself, he always wanted to maintain his independence within the surrealist group, and he talked about that, wanting to maintain. And he said, I've been labeled a surrealist, but I want to maintain my independence from the group. And he talked about the need to maintain in his words, his rigorous independence. And maybe that in a way, this photograph kind of speaks to that, because you're seeing, a number of key members, and this, that's often a critique that's given to the surrealist group, that it was kind of male dominated. But as we'll see in a later photograph, I'll complicate that a bit, because people are recognizing just the importance of women to the group now. But in this photograph, that's not evident. You can see André Breton, who was the leading theorist of the group. And he actually described Miro as being the most surrealist of us all. But as I'm suggesting, Miro himself wanted to maintain some distance from the Surrealist group. You can see here Dali, Ernst, Man Ray, Arp at the top, Tanguy, a number of these figures who are sort of key figures within the Surrealist group. So it's an interesting tension, but certainly Miro was interested in a lot of the Surrealist ideas around dreams, the importance of poetry, of literature, ideas around automatism. Breton talked in the Surrealist manifesto about Surrealism as being pure psychic automatism. This is a beautiful painting from 1926, where Miro is kind of again looking back to his upbringing in Spain, and this references the landscape around Montroig. And you see a dog here looking up at the moon, and the ladder, which is often a motif in his painting, kind of a symbol of escape from material concerns. And then moving on to the Pulitzer Promised Gift. This is such an interesting moment in 1927. This is a time, around this time, when Miro says, I want to assassinate painting. He talks about wanting to destroy painting. The idea of anti-painting is one which he explores. And I think, this painting, and this is part of a series of what are often called unprimed canvases, because he didn't prime them. traditionally, in terms of traditional painting techniques, a canvas has a priming applied to it. Generally, it's actually can be various different colors, but often it's white. But here you don't see that. He's just added a layer of glue sizing to sort of seal the canvas, but you see the color of the canvas. Evidently, there's no priming to mask that, and that was part of his, part of what he was talking about when he talked about assassinating painting, that he was moving away from sort of conventional painting techniques, more broadly away from the sort of tradition of sort of quasi-photographic naturalism, going back to the Renaissance, and he was subverting here. So there's an overall kind of sense of, obviously, a flatness. You can see the language that he's developing with the spider at the top right on a white cloud. 48 had a real meaning for him. In a later interview with the poet Jacques Dupin, who's the author of his Catalonia and wrote a couple of really interesting biographies of Miro. That interview took place in 1977, but Miro looked back and he remembered his days in a studio at a place called Rue Blomet in the southwest of Paris. And so his studio was at 45 Rue Blomet, and every time he went out of his studio, he saw the number 48, because that was the number of the studio opposite his. And he talked about that number as becoming, in his words, an obsession. And those are his words, an obsession. So that's kind of, this number is one. There are others too at this time, but this number is one that became, you can imagine he dreamed about it, became very important, and becomes part of his pictorial language here. And again, it's this very kind of beautiful calligraphic language that he's using. And I think, that these red spatters, you can see that, if you look at the painting, and I do encourage you to come and look at it closely, you can see the different degrees to which, there are sort of little globs of paint, and, sometimes the paint is flatter. But again, that kind of speaks to his really innovative paint techniques at this time. Again, sort of subverting more traditional techniques. Paint spatter is again something that looks forward to what the abstract expressionists were doing, alongside his interest in dripping paint. And I wanted to show this again, just thinking about space. So at the bottom left, number 1 is a Rue Blomet. And then at the top is Montmartre. So it's interesting, when Miro talked about his time at the Rue Blomet, he was close to Masson, and André Masson had a studio next to him. But he mentioned that the Breton, who was based up in Montmartre, he said he rarely descended the hill to come down to the Rue Blomet. So there were, again, that's sort of a little bit, there's a sort of spatial aspect there, which speaks to the distance that Miro wanted to maintain within the Surrealist group. So later on, he actually move his studio up to Montmartre, and this painting, interestingly, was painted after he left the Rue Blomet. It was painted in 1927 as a memory of his time at that studio. And then just to show you some other works within that group, they're all around the same size, and they all show, again, unprimed canvases, and that kind of pictographic language he uses. Referencing a head on the left, you can see the kind of paint spatter on the right, the white clouds, the white cloud that references 48. And then similar kind of thing here, and the way that sort of that the use of synecdoche that Miro uses, whereby he'll use here as sort of feathers as a way of representing or alluding to a whole bird in the base of the painting here. Again, this is the same size. So there was a show at MoMA, I think 2007, maybe 2008. Again, Anne Umland put together that brought together this a number of these paintings in a really kind of interesting way. And then sort of moving forward a little bit to 1936. This is a really important surrealist exhibition that took place in London, and a number of, this was, I'm showing this image in part just to emphasize the importance of women within that exhibition. Eileen Agar, for example, in the center here is a fascinating artist, produced a range, particularly relating to the sea, a range of really, really important work. Sheila Legg is an important performance artist. Then at the back, you can see a number of figures involved in that show. Herbert Reed, who was kind of the theorist for around the show, and of course Dali, who somehow always manages to appear in surrealist photographs. And we know this is the sort of famous exhibition where Dali gave a lecture in a deep sea diving suit. Miro was also, he had actually, he's not in this photograph, but he had and again, his relationship with surrealism is complicated, but he did show actually 22 works in this exhibition, a range of media, paintings, objects. He was also producing objects at this time, found objects, integrating those into his sculpture. So he had an important presence within this exhibition. And then I'm just showing, just to show sort of some of the range of the surrealist artists. Obviously, Ernst is a key figure. Arp was close to Miro, and then the American Dorothea Tanning, Dora Maar, produces these incredible uncanny photographs. As recent, there's a recent really interesting show at the Met, which really explored the sort of global aspect to surrealism. So I think that's being realized more and more. And then this is during the 30s, Miro is developing his kind of pictographic language, but 37, he comes back to a more kind of hyperreal approach to form in this important painting, which he worked on over about 4 months. You can see on the left, a fork is kind of inserted into an apple. There's a bottle behind. This is a loaf of what looks like stale bread. There's a shoe here. This kind of subverts conventional approaches to genre. Is it a still life, or is it a landscape? Is this the edge of a table, or is it the horizon line? And that's kind of characteristic of Miro's subversive approach throughout his career. And it's been suggested also there's maybe a suggestion of violence here with this kind of fork impaling the apple, and this is a moment. The historical context here is the Spanish Civil War, of course, from 1936 to 39. And often we don't think of Miro's work as being especially political, but it did have a political element actually, and that sort of taps into his earlier interests in Catalan identity and independence, and then at this point it's really tapping into his support for the Spanish Republican forces against the nationalist forces of Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War. So this was something that Miro's fellow Spaniard and good friend Picasso also felt strongly, and this is so interesting. This is a really major, one of Miro's most important works, and it's disappeared, it's lost unfortunately, but this was his 18 feet high painting of a reaper that he showed at the Paris World Fair in 1937 in the Spanish Pavilion. He was commissioned to do this by Republican supporters in Spain. So you can see behind Miro on his ladder, this is a kind of abstracted image of a reaper. Again, if you look, you can see he's wearing a baratina, that Catalan cap, and then has a sickle here. And this is actually the kind of Republican salute that he's making. So it's really a tragedy, I think, that this painting is lost. And even more so when you think about it in the context of Guernica, because Guernica was shown alongside Miro's work in the same pavilion, so they were kind of pendants. And Guernica is slightly larger, but not much so. And of course, this has become arguably Picasso's kind of iconic painting. And then sort of moving forward a little bit to around 1940, around the Second World War, Miro, in part because of difficulties in getting materials, he produces this group of very beautiful constellation paintings. This is one of, I think, around 23 watercolors, or gouaches and oil wash, I should say. But here you can see he's really moving away from a lot of his earlier work here. Of course, there are always connections, but here he's developing that sort of symbolic language that we'll see developing further in the painting of 1953. This is on a much smaller scale, but you can see the crescent moon, the stars here, and these kind of sort of humanoid figures, often bird-like forms that you see in the constellation works. This is a watercolor which is in the installation here. Again, this is an earlier Pulitzer gift. Again, you can see this bird-like form. It's almost kind of toucan-like. It's in pencil. Really interesting sort of motif here. There's often kind of sexual references in Miro's works, alongside his interest in nature, in landscape elements. So this is in pencil. You can see the asterisks like stars, the reference to the sun here, these really beautiful washes of color here. It's a really interesting sort of mix of media, wash, gouache, pencil in this drawing. And then this kind of leads on to the central work I started with alongside 48, which is this incredibly important painting from 1953, very large scale. Joseph Pulitzer himself actually wrote about this painting very poetically in the Pulitzer Collection catalog. So I encourage you to look that up. He talked about this work as being, in his words, a metaphor of cosmic space. And it's true, at this time, Miro is thinking about the cosmos. He's thinking about nature. He's thinking about, this work you can read as being, like the night sky, with these elements as being like planets. And then, there's references to a star here. Again, this is the red sun appearing, this time this kind of blue penumbra, the crescent moon, a motif that again and again appears in his work, this time this sort of violet aura around it. And then alongside those kind of cosmic elements, you've got this kind of bird-like figure. This is almost a kind of quasi-human figure with maybe seated here or maybe reclining. Are these legs? It's not clear. Is this a sort of egg-like head? So again, this is sort of Miro's kind of pictographic language. Where did that come from? That's not, he really developed it himself, but he was looking to, clay as somebody, for example, he was very interested in. His work is often actually connected also to Catalan Romanesque frescoes, which is kind of interesting in terms of sort of flatness in some of those works. But Miro does really take this language and make it his own. This is a related work from '53, which is at Harvard, and Miro had a close relationship with Harvard. He did a major mural painting for the dining room at Harvard in 51, which is now actually in MoMA. And then sort of continuing our installation here and trying to give some context to painting 53 and looking at some of the other references in the prints to similar iconography. So you can see the green crescent moon in the print at the left, again, the asterisk star, and of course the red sun on the right. Miro's a great printmaker. He works across a whole range of media, not just paintings, but ceramics, really important printmaker. And then, later on in his career, sculpture becomes more and more important for him too. And this work speaks to that. It's actually based on a smaller sculpture that he made in the 40s, but then he produced this cast bronze sculpture in the mid 60s. This is called Moonbird. So again, the moon as a theme that's key for him. This is the bird with his outstretched wings, and then the reference to the moon in the crescent form here and here. And then a couple of other prints in our exhibition. The one on the left, you can see that again, this motif of the star, the sun. Here we got the sun. This is kind of a abstracted sort of humanoid form. These are possibly legs here, sort of arching neck and maybe head here. And then the sort of the final thing I wanted to mention was just to talk briefly about Miro's sort of legacy. In 1947, he went to America for the first time, and his work had a really important influence on a lot of American artists. I mentioned before the connections between some of his work and American abstract expressionism, but that really develops in the late 40s. Robert Motherwell, for example, is somebody who really admired Miro and also had a really close connection to Spain. So this painting is called Catalonia. It's part of his Elegies series, Elegies to the Spanish Republic. And obviously there's a connection here with Miro because of Miro's sort of very visceral association, personal association with Catalonia. And then I wanted to show Lam. Wilfredo Lam's an artist I'm really interested in, and Lam actually fought in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side, and he visited Miro when he came to Paris in the late 30s. He was introduced by Picasso, so he was part of that circle around Miro and developing his own very, very personal kind of dreamlike language that references out of Miro. So then just to kind of finish up here, to take you back to the installation shot. Again, just to emphasize the importance of these two works, 48. I really do believe that this is from, that work from the late 20s is among the most sort of radical moments in Miro's career, where his work is related to surrealism, but it's very, he maintains his independence and his distance. And as I said, the painting on the left is really a canonical example of Miro's kind of dreamlike, whimsical, pictographic language of signs and symbols. So it's really exciting to have these works on view at the moment. So I hope you'll come to see them. I think, the installation runs until August the 21st. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Simon. That was fantastic. And yeah, we do have a few questions, so let's jump right in. Someone has asked, do we know if Miro wrote or talked about what his symbols meant?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite an extensive, there's a book by somebody called Miro Triangle, which speaks to the various interviews that that Miro gave. So he doesn't actually. I think he wanted to keep the sun, the moon, the motifs like the spider, etc., and maintain a kind of element of mystery, keep them sort of fairly elliptical. So he doesn't actually. It's not like he's giving precise meanings to them. And he talks about the importance of connecting to nature, as I said. He doesn't talk about himself as an abstract painter. So that grounding in nature is important. But I also think it was important for him that the viewer, the spectator, brought their own meanings and connections to the work. So no, I'm not as many as perhaps I like. I mean, when I was doing this talk, I was thinking about that too, and I didn't find as many meanings as I perhaps expected.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's see. Someone else has asked, there's a drastic aesthetic shift from his hyper-realist style to his pictographic style in the 1920s. Do you know why that is? Were there any particular movements, national events, or personal circumstances that could have contributed to this?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was, I sort of referenced that at the end, because obviously you want to think about where it is such an individual style, but where does it come from? I don't think Klee actually is quite an important figure here. Klee's his works generally on a smaller scale, the watercolors that he produces, but the kind of language, the very personal language of signs and symbols that he develops, I think that was an influence on Miro. Picasso actually, in some of the decorative works that Picasso is producing in the early 20s have that same kind of pictographic element. So I think that could have also been an influence on Miro when he was in Paris. And then, as I said before, the sort of flattening effects, the sort of abstracting effects that he saw in some of Catalan art, folk art, Romanesque frescoes, in the areas that he'd grown up, I think those could have been an influence too.
That's interesting, because the next question was actually, was Miró familiar with or influenced by Paul Klee? So I don't know if there's more you can speak to that relationship.
Yeah, there's a close association. I mean, Klee's a little bit, in some ways, a little bit, because Klee is often associated with Surrealism too, but maintains some distance, like Miro. Yeah, so yes, but he did know Klee's work well, and he admired it. So I think there's an important connection there.
All right, well, thank you. I don't have any other questions that have popped up. So I think we'll just end it right there. So thank you so much, Simon. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. And I hope that those who are in St. Louis and have the chance to visit this installation, I hope you can do it, perhaps a nice activity for the holiday weekend. So please keep an eye on slam.org/events for upcoming in-person and virtual programming at the museum. And thank you all and have a great day.
I just say, Jessica, it's great for families. If families can come, their kids love these works too. I think.
Perfect. Yeah, lots of fun, like searching and looking at, looking at all those symbols. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Simon. Have a good day, everyone.